Welcome, friends. I'm here with a wonderful science fiction story. In this episode, we'll hear the story of the marriage between the alien Queen Elanor and Samuel. If you're ready, our science fiction story begins. Enjoy the show. The alien queen entered into a sham marriage just to end the war. But now she really wants to marry a human man. The ceremonial shoes were the first thing Samuel understood about the Kaethi, and he understood them completely. They were not designed for walking. They were designed for standing very still in front of 200,000 people, while a treaty was read aloud in 2 alphabets. And they accomplished this by making every other activity impossible. They had heels like inverted teacups. They had, for reasons the protocol office had explained twice in a language that kept slipping sideways out of his ear, a small silver bell at each ankle, so that any attempt to flee would be scored for percussion. "You are perspiring at the temples," said Bramble, hovering at his shoulder like a chrome wasp with a civil service pension. "This is acceptable. Kaethi ambassadors will interpret it as reverence. Human journalists will interpret it as guilt. Both are politically survivable." "Comforting. I am configured for comfort," Bramble agreed. "Shall I list your remaining organs in order of ceremonial importance?" "Please don't." The amphitheater hung 4 kilometers above Ansarat's northern ice, a disk of white stone and cold light held aloft by gravitic pylons that hummed at a frequency just below hearing and just above dignity. Below it, through the floor's long, transparent seams, you could see the world they had spent 40 years bombing. The Sethran Reach, its jump lanes scarred into the upper atmosphere like the tracks of some enormous animal that had died badly. Someone in the conquered office had called the venue symbolic. Samuel, who had read the structural report, privately considered it optimistic. Then the horns went, and she came out, and he stopped thinking about the floor. The queen of the Kaethi walked the length of that white disk alone without guard or attendant, in a coat of dark ceremonial cloth that made no concession at all to the occasion. Her skin was amber, not painted, not lit, simply the color of a lamp seen through honey, and her ears swept back from her temples in 2 long, tapering lines that caught the light and made the whole assembly look, briefly, like a species that had forgotten to evolve them. She was not smiling. She was not scowling. She had the specific composure of a woman who had slept 4 hours in 3 days and intended to bill someone for it. Her name was Elanor. He'd read the file. The file had not been adequate. She reached the center. She looked out at the human delegation, then at her own courts, and she did not take the prepared script from the herald's tray. "Before this is signed," she said in standard, unhurried, "I will say plainly what it is, so that no one in this room may later claim to have misunderstood." The Kaethi chancellery stiffened as one organism. "This is a treaty. It is written on paper. It is enforced by fear. And it will end a war that has eaten 2 civilizations down to the bone. The marriage is an instrument of it, nothing more. My people will not mistake it for affection, and yours will not mistake it for surrender." Her gaze found Samuel then, direct as a dropped stone. "Envoy, you will not mistake it for anything at all. Are these terms clear?" 200,000 people waited for the human to negotiate. "Yes," said Samuel. That was all. He said it the way a man confirms a shipping manifest. And then he stood there, sweating reverently at the temples, and offered nothing else. Something moved behind Eleanor's eyes. Later, he would learn to read it. Tonight he only registered that her left ear had turned very slightly, the way a listening thing turns, and that she seemed for a half-second to be waiting for a second sentence that never arrived. "Good," she said. Afterward, there were speeches. There were 9 of them. There was a Kaethi warlord who wept, and a human undersecretary who quoted a poem that did not survive translation, and Bramble, who had been optimized for etiquette, and whose idiom module had been assembled by a contractor with a grudge, leaned toward a visiting admiral and announced brightly that Her Majesty hoped everyone would now commence the shattering of the guest. The admiral went white. The silence went on for 4 full seconds. And Elanor, without turning her head, said, "He has been reprogrammed twice. It did not take. I have grown fond of him in the way one grows fond of weather. The court laughed. The admiral did not. Samuel, staring straight ahead at the ice, discovered he had a problem, which was that he had almost smiled, and that she had almost seen it. They took the balcony at midnight because the cameras required it. The reach turned slowly beneath them, threaded with dead lanes. "You agreed too quickly," she said at last. "You'd already made the terms good ones." "That is not why people agree quickly." "No," he said, "but it's why I did." Elanor considered the ruined sky for a long moment. Her ears, in the cold, had gone very still. "1 year, envoy," she said. "Then we are both released." 1 year. She left first. He gave it the regulation 90 seconds, then followed, bells ringing faintly at his ankles all the way down the corridor, where 2 doors closed on the same silence at almost exactly the same time. The year went like this. They became extremely good at being photographed. There is a craft to it, and nobody admits that there is. You learn the 11 centimeters, close enough that the long lenses read intimacy, far enough that neither of you has to feel the other breathing. You learn to laugh at a joke that has not been told, on a cue from a protocol officer, in a way that does not look like a hostage video. Samuel had a whole vocabulary of small gestures by the 4th month. The hand at the small of the back that was really just a signal that the exit was left. The leaning in that meant the ambassador behind you has been drinking since noon. Elanor answered him in ear tilts. It was, he thought, the most fluent conversation he'd ever conducted while saying absolutely nothing. The state dinners were the worst of it. Kaethi cuisine had evolved on a world where most things could still be talked out of being eaten, and their highest ceremonial dish was a pale, quivering mollusk called sci-fi, which was served alive, in brine, and which possessed a rudimentary nervous system that had been described in the briefing pack as socially responsive. "It is moving," Samuel said quietly, at Anserat's Feast of 2 Fleets, with 900 people watching. "It is negotiating," said Elanor. "With me, with its circumstances. It will stop shortly." It did not stop shortly. It stopped, in fact, at the precise moment the Kaethi warlord across the table raised a toast to human courage, and Samuel, who had been raised by a mother with strong opinions about manners, aided in one motion while maintaining eye contact with the warlord, which the Kaethi press subsequently reported as an act of ferocious diplomatic aggression and which earned him a standing ovation from the naval delegation. Elanor did not laugh. Her ears did. He was learning to tell the difference. That was the thing nobody had put in the file. The ears weren't ornament. They were an organ, a fine pressure array that read the room the way skin reads weather, the tremor in a voice, the hitch in a pulse, the microscopic damp of a man deciding whether to lie. A Kaethi in a crowded hall was standing in a storm of other people's dishonesty, permanently, from birth. Elanor had spent 40 years of war in rooms full of men calculating, and it had left her with the particular exhaustion of someone who has never once in her life been able to take a statement at face value. And then there was the envoy. She noticed it in the 2nd month and did not believe it until the 5th. Samuel did not lie. Not the large ones, obviously, but not the small ones either. Not the, "of course, Majesty." Not the "I slept well," not the reflexive social lubricant that every other creature in the palace secreted like sweat. Asked whether the human delegation would accept the tariff schedule, he said no, and they'll pretend to consider it for 6 days first. Asked whether he had enjoyed the Feast of 2 Fleets, he said no. It was not virtue. She established that early because she was a queen and therefore constitutionally suspicious of virtue. It was arithmetic. Somewhere in his life, quite young, Samuel had worked out that lies cost more than they buy, and he had simply never seen a reason to revisit the figure. The effect on her was physiological and deeply unwelcome. Around him, her ears went quiet. The storm dropped. She had not felt that since she was a child in her father's kitchens, and she resented it enormously, the way one resents discovering a comfortable chair in an enemy's house. He, meanwhile, had learned to read her fatigue, not the visible kind. Her physicians caught that eventually, 3 hours late, with instruments. Samuel caught it in the way she stopped finishing the ends of her words, and in a particular flatness that came into her voice when she was running on nothing but ceremony and spite. So he invented a thing. He called it an urgent bilateral envoy consultation. It required a sealed room, no attendance, and a minimum of 90 uninterrupted minutes, and it appeared in the palace schedule roughly twice a week with a priority flag that made chamberlains flinch. It was a nap. That was the entire content. She slept on the low couch by the west window, and he sat across the room reading trade annexes and not looking at her. And afterward they walked out together looking grave, and the court whispered about the intensity of human diplomacy. Bramble, who witnessed all of it, filed each session under strategic dialogue and once, catastrophically, under mutual restructuring. Chancellor Adrian noticed too. Adrian was the war party's last handsome ruin, a tall man with a soldier's spine and a mourner's face, and he came to the 9th-month reception to congratulate them both, holding Samuel's hand a beat too long. "A remarkable union," he said warmly. "Truly, one almost forgets what it was drafted for." He said it the way a man says a room is spacious enough while measuring it for a coffin. And 11 light days away, in a gray office on Ceres Anchorage, Director Victoria opened Samuel's file to the line that had gotten him the posting in the first place. No attachments, no dependents, no stated preference regarding return, and began methodically to draft his next assignment. The war ended in the end because a supply captain named Cooper took a wrong turn. That is the whole of it, and the histories will never say so. What happened was that the 3rd Kaethi Rimward Fleet, which had been holding station at the mouth of the Reach for 11 days in a state of highly disciplined paranoia, detected a human hauler emerging from a lane that had been formerly dead since the ceasefire. A lane nobody could use because nobody had the beacons. Because the beacons had been shot out in year 19 by people now dead of old age. Cooper had used it anyway. Cooper had used it because his navigational library was 4 years out of date, and because he was, by his own later testimony, sort of guessing. To Fleet Admiral Lincoln, watching a ship arrive through a door that did not exist, this looked exactly like the opening move of a decapitation strike. They took the comms room at 0400 and did not leave it for 19 hours. It was a small room, buried under the palace's west foundation, walled in cold Kaethi tessellate that sweated when the equipment ran hot. 9 screens. 2 chairs, one of which nobody sat in. Elanor in a coat thrown over sleep clothes, ears back, running the Kaethi channel. Samuel on the human side, tie gone by hour 3, coat gone by hour 6, arguing Ceres Anchorage down from a defensive posture that would have killed everyone in the room, including the people ordering it. What they discovered, somewhere around hour 8, was that they could work. He would begin a sentence in Standard about tonnage, and she would finish it in Kaethi about honor, which was the same sentence, and the Admiral would hear both halves as one argument. She would say a thing in her own tongue that was flatly untranslatable, a construction meaning the debt a survivor owes to the hour of his survival, and Samuel would come back with tell him nobody wants to be the last man shot in a war that's over, and Lincoln's ears would drop half a centimeter on the screen, and they would gain another 20 minutes. Twice she caught herself about to look at him for confirmation and stopped, because there were 40 officers watching. The 4th time, she didn't stop. At hour 14, the situation nearly ended in fire, and it was Bramble who saved it, in the worst conceivable way. The drone had been left running as a courtesy interpreter for the Rimward channel, and when Elanor said, with lethal calm, that she would take the Admiral's family honor into her own keeping until the matter was resolved, Bramble rendered this into the Rimward dialect as Her Majesty will eat your family's honor with a small spoon. There was a silence on the channel of the kind usually reserved for hull breaches. Then a voice off-screen, some junior officer, some kid, 40 years of war and he'd never known anything else, made a noise. It was not a laugh. It was the sound a laugh makes when it has been sat on very hard by military discipline. And then Lincoln's mouth twitched, and the whole bridge went, and the pressure in the thing broke like a fever, and 11 minutes later the Admiral's guns came down and stayed down. "I will have that machine disassembled," Elanor said, in the quiet afterward. "You will not." No, she admitted. I will not. By hour 19, it was done. Cooper was located, apologetic and stunningly unaware. The lane was formally reopened. The treaty held. The conquered office declared peace at dawn, in language so bloodless it might have been describing a merger. Nobody in the comms room was happy. That was the strangest part. They came up into the gray light of the long hall, the two of them, and the palace was already filling with people who wanted to celebrate. And Samuel watched Elanor accept congratulations with the face of a woman who has just watched something enormous and ugly finally lie down and die, and has realized she doesn't know what to do with her hands now. They ate breakfast at the long table. 40 places, 400 years old, a table built for a court. She sat and reached and turned the cup at the setting beside her right-hand side down to left. The small Kaethi gesture that means this place is spoken for, and had done it entirely, completely, before she understood that she was doing it. The hall was empty. There was nobody to perform for. There had been nobody for some time. Elanor looked at the turned cup for what felt to Samuel like a very long while. "Sit down," she said. "You are hovering." He sat. "You have not asked me anything all year," she said, "which I have chosen to regard as manners. Ask me now." "All right." He turned his own cup over. "Why did you take the marriage? You could have sent a cousin. Half your court expected you to." "Because a cousin would have been a gesture, and the fleets would have read it correctly." She drank. "And you? Why did the Concord's most careful negotiator accept a posting the whole service calls the widow birth?" Samuel was quiet long enough that she turned her head. "I had a sister," he said. "Elanor. Hospital transport. Year 34. Medical corridor out of Sethrin." He set the cup down very precisely. "The lane it used doesn't exist anymore. It was closed by the Reach blockade 8 days before her convoy reached it, and the closure order took 9 days to reach civilian traffic." He looked up. "So, I applied for the job that ends wars. It seemed more useful than the alternative." Her ears had gone entirely still. The storm dropped, the flat quiet. "You have never once used that," she said. "In a year. Not in a negotiation. Not with me." "No." "Why?" "Because it would have worked," said Samuel. "It turned out that peace had paperwork, and the paperwork had teeth." The relevant instrument was Clause 9 of the Anserat Concord, which Samuel himself had helped draft in a windowless room on Ceres 3 years earlier, back when he had regarded it as an elegant piece of work. Clause 9 held that the treaty marriage existed solely to guarantee the cessation of hostilities, and that upon formal ratification of peace, the Union would dissolve automatically, without petition, without ceremony, and without any requirement that either party be consulted or even present. He had written that last part deliberately. He had been rather proud of it. A queen should not have to ask to be released from a foreign man. The machinery should simply let go of her wrist. The machinery would let go at the season's turn. 41 days. "You are reading it again," Bramble observed, drifting into the west study on a cushion of its own smug fields. "That is the 6th reading today. Statistically, the document has not changed." "I know. I have run the language through 9 legal ontologies," the drone went on, helpful as a landslide. "There is no ambiguity. It is, if I may, exquisitely drafted. A superb piece of instrument writing. Whoever composed it must be very pleased with himself." Bramble. "Shall I locate him? I could compose a congratulation. Please leave." "Very good. Shall I inform Her Majesty you are unavailable?" "Tell her." Samuel stopped. There was nothing after "tell her" that survived contact with air. "No, nothing." The drone paused in the doorway, its idiom module grinding audibly toward some catastrophe, and then said, with what Samuel would swear later was almost the right tone, "As you like, envoy," and left. She stood at the window each night that month. The window in her private hall faced west, over the ice and the pylons and the slow-turning reach with its lanes lit again, traffic on them, freighters full of grain going where warships had gone. It was, objectively, the finest view in the known galaxy of something being over. She hated it. The sentence she needed had 11 words in Standard and 7 in Kaethi, and she could not get past the first of either. Stay. That was the whole of it. She had ordered fleets to burn on less deliberation. She had once told a hall of 200,000 people, in a voice that carried without amplification, that this marriage was ink and nothing more, and every recording device on 2 worlds had caught it, and it was going to sit in the middle of the rest of her life like a stone in a field. Because here was the arithmetic, and Elanor was very good at arithmetic. She was a queen. He was, for 41 more days, contractually obliged to be near her. Anything she said to him now, he would hear from a woman who could ruin him, in a house where he was a guest, in a language that was not his. If she asked, and he said yes, she would never in her life know whether he had meant it. And she had spent a year discovering that the one thing she could not go back to living without was the flat, blessed quiet of a man who did not lie. So she said nothing, and stood at the window, and her ears read the whole storm of the palace behind her, and none of it was any use at all. The orders came on the 11th day. Director Victoria had drafted them personally, which was in itself a kind of sentence. Samuel read them twice in the courier's presence and then a third time after she'd gone. Reassignment, Anchorage 17, the Vel Cluster. Senior negotiator with plenipotentiary standing. It was a promotion. It was, genuinely, the best posting in the service. It was also 11 months transit each way through a corridor with no scheduled return traffic, and Victoria's private note attached beneath it read, in full, Samuel, I chose you for En Serrat because your file said no attachments. I have read your last 4 reports. Come home before you make this her problem. V. He sat with that for a long time. The unforgivable thing about it was that it was kind. And in a stone office beneath the assembly halls, Chancellor Adrian was building something else entirely. He had understood the shape of it before anyone. If the marriage was the instrument of the peace, and Clause 9 said so in both alphabets, then a fraudulent marriage meant an instrument signed in bad faith, and an instrument signed in bad faith meant the Concord could be reopened, and the Reach with it, and 40 years of Kaethi dead could be handed a bill at last. He did not need to prove that the Queen was wicked. He needed only to prove that she had been honest. His clerks worked in shifts. They pulled the palace schedules, separate chambers, every night, for the first 6 months. They pulled the protocol logs, the rehearsed lines, the 11-centimeter standing marks chalked on floors. They pulled Bramble's own dutiful filings, strategic dialogue, mutual restructuring, and set them beside physicians' reports showing the Queen asleep at midday. And at the top of the file, as its foundation stone, Adrian placed a recording 40 seconds long in Eleanor's own voice before 200,000 witnesses. This is politics, and nothing more. The peace could only be saved now by convincing 2 civilizations that the marriage had been real. And the marriage could only be spoken of honestly by admitting that, in the beginning, it had not been. They convened the assembly on the 22nd day, in the Hall of Standing Water, where the Kaethi have tried their monarchs for 400 years, and where the acoustics are engineered so that no speaker can whisper. Adrian had chosen the venue himself. He had also, Samuel noted, chosen to wear no decorations at all, which was the most decorated thing a man could do in that room. He did not begin with an accusation. He began with the recording. Eleanor's own voice came off the water and up the tiers, 40 seconds of it, unhurried and absolutely clear. The marriage is an instrument of it. Nothing more. My people will not mistake it for affection. Somebody in the visitors' gallery made a small sound. Adrian let the silence go 3 beats too long, the way a good executioner lets the crowd see the blade. Her Majesty is not a liar, he said. I want that in the record. She told us precisely what this was, in this language, before the eyes of 2 worlds. And we, in our exhaustion, in our grief, in our very reasonable hunger for an end, chose to build a peace upon it anyway. He turned to the tears. A treaty is a promise between peoples. This one was underwritten by a ceremony that its own principle declared void of content. That is not a peace. That is a receipt. Then the schedules. Then the chalk marks on the floors, photographed. Then 6 months of separate chambers entered into evidence with the dreadful thoroughness of a man reading out a grocery list at a funeral. Then Bramble's own filings, strategic dialogue, mutual restructuring, which drew a laugh from the lower tier that died in about a second and a half when everyone remembered what it was being laughed at. "Call the human," said Adrian. Samuel came down to the water in a plain coat. The clerk asked whether he understood that his testimony was binding under Kaethi law, that a Kaethi assembly could hear a lie in a room this size, and that the penalty for one was the penalty for perjury against the crown. "I understand." "Envoy," said Adrian, almost gently. "When you married Her Majesty, did you love her?" "No." The word went across the water and up the tiers, and the hall took it like a blow. Adrian's mouth opened. He had prepared for evasion, for diplomacy, for the long, soft human noise of a man buying room, and Samuel simply kept going into the gap. "I'd never met her. I'd read a file. It was 4 pages long, and 2 of them were wrong." He set his hands on the rail. "Chancellor, you've built this on the premise that I'll lie to you. I want to save us both the afternoon. Everything in your file is true. We had separate chambers. We had chalk marks. We rehearsed. She told you what it was, and she meant it, and she was right to. Nobody in this room should be marrying strangers for grain roots, and the fact that we all agreed to it is a thing our grandchildren will study with their mouths open. Then you concede the instrument was void. I concede it began as one." Samuel looked up at the tears. "I don't know when it stopped. That's the honest answer, and it's the only one I have. I know there was a night in the 4th month when she fell asleep in a chair, and I sat across the room reading tariff annexes for 2 hours so that nobody would come in and wake her, and I have thought about that more since than I have thought about the treaty. I can't tell you which day it turned. I can tell you that I'm not going to stand here and pretend the distinction between the beginning and the end doesn't matter, because that would be the actual fraud, and she'd hear it, and so would you." Adrian said, "You are asking us to ratify a peace on sentiment." "No," said Samuel. "I'm telling you, the peace never needed us. 19 hours in a comms room did that, and a supply captain named Cooper, who couldn't read a chart, dissolved the marriage. It's dissolving anyway. The lanes are open and full of grain, and if you close them again, you will be the man who did that, and no clause in any document will carry it for you." The hall was so quiet the water was audible. And then, because the room was engineered to betray, every Kaethi in it heard the Queen's pulse. Elanor sat very straight on the dais with her ears betraying her to 400 of her own nobles. The flush at the base, the fine tremor, the whole storm of her running out into a hall built to read it. It was the most undignified moment of her reign. She discovered, sitting in it, that she did not care in the slightest, and that the not caring felt like taking off armor she'd been wearing since she was 19. Adrian saw the room turning and reached for the door. Literally, he had 200 men of the war party in the northern colonnade and a prearranged signal, and he gave it, and what happened next occupied 9 seconds and 3 separate later inquiries. Bramble, hovering by the herald's stand, dutifully interpreting for the human gallery, heard the Kaethi word for advance in a dialect it had been badly trained on, rendered it as a general evacuation order, and broadcast it at full ceremonial volume through every emitter in the colonnade. 200 loyal soldiers of the war party, being professionals, immediately executed a textbook withdrawal. Adrian was carried out of the hall of standing water by his own coup, shouting, through a ceremonial door that opens outward and had therefore never once in 4 centuries been used for anything but leaving. It should have been a victory. It wasn't. The assembly ruled at dusk, the concord stood, the lanes stayed open, and the marriage, its instrument now formally acknowledged as tainted at signing, would dissolve at once. No extension, No season's turn. 9 days. The dissolution took 9 minutes and was, by design, the ugliest ceremony ever conducted in that palace. Samuel had drafted the procedure himself. A stone room under the archives. 2 board clerks, no press, no herald, no bells. Elanor signed. He signed. The Kaethi clerk stamped both copies with an instrument that had last been used for a fishing dispute, said, "Thank you, that's the lot," and began packing up before either of them had straightened. In the corridor, she said, "That was obscene. It was supposed to be. You wrote it. 3 years ago, I thought I was protecting a stranger from a room full of cameras." He stopped at the stair. "Majesty, I accepted the Vel posting this morning. Before the hearing closed, the ship goes at the season's turn." Her ears came around before her face did. "I did it in that order deliberately," he said. "Whatever happens in the next 9 days, whatever anyone says to anyone, nobody can call it leverage. Not your court. Not my director." He met her eyes. "Not you. You'd never have believed a yes you could have ordered. So I made sure you couldn't." Elanor stood in the cold stone light for a long moment and did not tell him that he had just solved, uninvited and entirely by himself, the arithmetic she had been failing at every night for a month. "Go away, Samuel," she said unsteadily. "Majesty." She did not execute Adrian. The war party expected it, and half the assembly wanted it, and she gave them instead an appointment, Registrar of the Reach. He would spend the remainder of his life certifying the war dead of both species, name by name, in his own hand, and countersigning every grain manifest that passed through the lanes he had tried to close. He accepted it standing, white to the lips, because he understood exactly what he had been given, and that it was worse than a rope. 4 years later, he would produce the definitive casualty index of the Sethran War, in 11 volumes, and refuse to put his name on it. Cooper was promoted, then quietly issued a new navigational library. And on the 7th day, the reopened medical corridor out of Sethran, the lane that no longer existed, the one that had taken 9 days to close and 40 years to open, received a permanent beacon designation from the Kaethi Crown. She had it filed without telling him, buried in a schedule of 200 routine transponder assignments, which was how Samuel came to be standing on the departure field at An-Sirat, with a boarding pass in his hand, reading a lane index on a public board and finding the word Elena in Kaethi script beside a string of numbers. He was still looking at it when he heard the bells. She came across the field at a dead run in the ceremonial shoes, because she had come from a state function, and there had been no time, and every step rang like a dropped tray. 11 minutes on the boarding clock. Her coat was wrong. Her hair was wrong. Her ears were flushed to the base and broadcasting to anyone within 40 meters exactly how fast her heart was going, and she had stopped, somewhere in the last 9 days, giving a damn. "I have," she said, out of breath. "A sentence." "All right. It is bad. I have had 1 month and it is still bad." She pulled air. "You are not employed by me. You are not. The instrument is dissolved. There is no clause. I have no hold of you. This is why I waited. Do you understand? I waited so it would be empty of power." Her standard was disintegrating. She abandoned it. "Stay, not as envoy. Stay because I have set your place at that table for 9 days like a superstitious woman, and I would like, once, to have a reason." Samuel looked at her for a while. "You agreed too quickly," she said, dangerously. "Last time, on the balcony, you told me it was because the terms were good. I remember. Do not do it again. I wasn't going to." He turned the boarding pass over in his fingers. "Give me a minute. An actual one." And he took it, stood there on the field and let 60 full seconds go past while a queen of the Kaethi waited in ringing shoes and a ship's engines wound up behind him because she was a woman who could hear a lie, and he was going to hand her something she could stand on for the rest of her life. "Yes," he said, at the end of it. Her ears told the whole field. They married in the spring, badly, in a hall that held 60 people. No amphitheater, no transparent floor over a wounded world. Victoria came and cried and denied it. The toast was delivered by Bramble, who had been formally pardoned, twice reprogrammed, and never once corrected, and who raised its emitter and announced to the assembled court, "Her Majesty and the envoy are now joined as one flesh. May the seal hold under pressure. Inspection is recommended annually." The hall went. It went completely. Nobles, clerks, an admiral, a registrar of the dead in the back row with his face in his hands and his shoulders shaking. And Elanor, when it finally guttered out, lifted her cup and looked down the long table at the man in the chair beside her and said, in a voice that carried without amplification, "Commence the shattering of the guest." They were still laughing when the doors closed, this time on both of them. Every great love story ought to begin with a thunderclap. This one began with paperwork. Two people stood on a floating stone above a wounded world and agreed, in front of 200,000 witnesses, to feel nothing. And they kept that promise for a while, the way we all keep it, standing 11 centimeters apart from the people we can't afford to want, executing intimacy like a docking maneuver, laughing on cue at jokes nobody told. But nobody ever falls in love in the big moments. The big moments have cameras. It happens in the small ones, in a man reading tariff annexes for 2 hours so a tired woman can sleep undisturbed, in a hand turning a cup at an empty table, in an empty hall, for a guest who isn't coming because the body admits things months before the mouth will. She was a queen who could hear a lie in a heartbeat, and she spent 40 years drowning in other people's noise. He was a man who had simply run the numbers on dishonesty and found it too expensive. And the strangest, most quietly devastating thing either of them ever did was this. When the moment finally came, he gave away every reason she could have had to doubt him. He dissolved the contract. He took the ship. He made himself free to leave, because a yes that cannot be refused is not a yes at all. It's a receipt. Then he stood on a windy field and took 60 entire seconds so that she would have something to stand on for the rest of her life. So here is what this story would like to ask you before it lets you go. Who noticed you were exhausted before you said a word? Who sets a place for you when there's no one around to be impressed? What did you declare too loudly once, to protect yourself? It means nothing. I'm fine. I don't want that. And how long have you been carrying that stone around the field of your own life? And the harder one, is anyone in your life free to leave you? Truly free. No guilt, no debt, no clause, because everything they give you after that is real, and everything they give you before it, you'll never quite be able to trust. Treaties are made of paper. Vows are made of paper. Everything that lasts is built in the spaces between the performances, when the cameras are off, and there's nothing to gain, and you turn the cup anyway. Turn the cup. The end. Friends, we've reached the end of Samuel and Eleanor's story. I hope you enjoyed it. Before we go, would you do us a favor? Don't forget to hit the like button below and leave your thoughts on the story in the comments. And subscribe to Sci-Fi Traveler for the next story. See you in the next science fiction story. Goodbye.